Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into an age that looks perfectly respectable on the surface and completely unhinged the moment you scratch the paint. Victorian England. This is the era of tidy manners, stiff collars, and grand pianos, where everyone looks deeply serious in their photographs, mostly because holding still for 30 seconds is difficult when your corset is quietly trying to fold you in half. It is a world of top hats and afternoon tea, yes, but also a world where your wallpaper can poison you. Your babies are dosed with opium to keep them peaceful, and photographing your dead grandmother in her Sunday best is considered a lovely keepsake. Before we go any further, a genuine thank you to whoever left this suggestion in the comments. You have excellent taste in historical nonsense, and requests like yours are the whole reason this channel keeps growing. If you enjoy what happens here, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to, no pressure at all. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you, because it is always somehow the middle of the night somewhere. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, fluff your very safe non-poisonous pillow, and settle in. Let us wonder about a few things together. Have you ever wondered what it truly felt like to live in an age this strange? Did people really keep jewellery made from the hair of their dead relatives? Were the dresses actually dyed with poison? Could you sip your tea correctly while 40 separate rules of etiquette judged your every move? Would you survive a summer by the sea when getting into the water required its own tiny wheeled shed? And what exactly did they feed the baby to make it sleep so soundly? And should we all be a little concerned? Well, you're about to find out. Congratulations, you have just woken up in 1862, in a narrow brick house that smells faintly of coal smoke, boiled cabbage, and secrets. Your clothing weighs more than you do. Your medicine cabinet is essentially a small pharmacy of things that could kill you, and somewhere downstairs a portrait of a deceased aunt is watching you with mild disapproval. Welcome to the strangest respectable century in history. Try not to touch the green wallpaper. Let us start with the photographs. In your century, having your picture taken is rare, expensive, and requires sitting frozen for an age while a serious man hides beneath a black cloth. So when someone in the family dies, often a child, the grieving relatives do the sensible thing and call the photographer, because this might be the only image of that person that will ever exist. The deceased is washed, dressed in their finest, and arranged with enormous care, sometimes laid out as though peacefully asleep, sometimes seated in a favourite chair surrounded by living relatives who are trying very hard not to blink. The result is a portrait that looks almost gentle, almost restful, right up until you notice that everyone else in the frame is slightly blurred from breathing, and one figure is not blurred at all. To make sense of this, you have to understand the camera of your era. Photography is new, astonishing, and slow. Sitting for a portrait means holding perfectly still for many long seconds while the light does its patient work, and any twitch, sway, or nervous blink smears your face into a ghostly blur. Living subjects fidget, babies squirm, children are hopeless. But the dead, well, the dead are marvellous at holding a pose. They do not flinch, they do not sneeze, and they never once complain about their neck. The grim little irony of your century is that the sharpest, clearest face in many a family photograph belongs to the one person no longer breathing. Now think about the money. A photograph is a genuine luxury, something a working family might save for over many months, and a great many people go their entire lives without ever having one taken. So when a child falls ill and slips away, and remember that a heartbreaking number of children in your century do not survive to grow up, the family suddenly faces a terrible truth. There is no image in a drawer, nothing on the wall, nothing at all to remember that little face by. The photographer becomes the very last chance to hold on. And so the camera is called not to a birthday or a wedding, but to a deathbed. The lengths people go to are tender and unsettling in equal measure. The body is dressed in its very best and posed with real love. A baby might be cradled in its mother's arms as though merely sleeping, tucked among blankets and favourite toys. Cheeks are sometimes tinted a soft pink by hand after the picture is made, and now and then a hint of open eyes is painted delicately onto the closed lids, all to soften the stillness, to make the departed look one last time like themselves. You've probably heard the wilder tales, the ones about corpses propped bolt upright on hidden metal stands and posed to look alive among the family. Take those with a healthy pinch of salt. The posing stands were real, but they were built to steady the living during their long wobbly exposures, not to hold the full dead weight of a body. Most of these portraits are quieter and sadder than that. A figure at rest, a family gathered close, grief pressed carefully into a single frame. To your modern eye, keeping a photograph of a dead relative on the mantel is deeply macabre. To the Victorians, it is simply love with a slow shutter speed. So the next time you take 40 nearly identical pictures of your lunch and delete every single one, spare a thought for a century where one blurry image of someone you adored was a treasure worth grieving over. They did not photograph the dead because they were morbid. They did it because they could not bear to forget a face. Death does not stop when the photograph dries. It moves straight into your wardrobe and refuses to leave. When Prince Albert dies at the end of 1861, Queen Victoria is so shattered that she puts on black and essentially never takes it off again, wearing mourning for the remaining 4 decades of her life. The nation follows her lead with tremendous enthusiasm. There are rigid stages of grief to obey: deep mourning, then second mourning, then half mourning, each with its own approved fabrics, colours and lengths of time. A widow is expected to shroud herself in dull black crepe for a year and a day at the very least, avoiding anything shiny, cheerful or remotely fun. Grief in your century is not simply a feeling you have, it is a dress code you're required to follow correctly. Let us start at the top, with the Queen, because she sets the tone for everyone beneath her. Victoria and Albert were genuinely deeply devoted, and when he dies, something in her closes for good. She keeps his rooms exactly as he left them, has his clothes laid out fresh each day, and drapes herself in black so completely and for so long that the public eventually begins grumbling that their widowed queen has vanished from public life altogether. But the fashion is set. If the most powerful woman in the world is in mourning, then mourning becomes the very height of respectability, and the whole country dresses for a funeral that never quite ends. For an ordinary widow, the rules are astonishingly precise. In the first and deepest stage, you wear black and only black, and not just any black. The fabric of choice is crepe, a dull, crimped, scratchy silk chosen specifically because it does not shine, since shine suggests joy, and joy is strictly forbidden. No jewellery is permitted except pieces made of jet, a black fossilised stone dug from the cliffs at Whitby, or perhaps some tasteful mourning jewellery woven from hair, which we'll get to shortly. This deeper stage drags on for a year and a day, and only then are you slowly, grudgingly allowed to soften. After that comes second mourning, where a little trim and quiet detail creep back in, and finally half mourning, where you're at last permitted a daring splash of grey, mauve or lavender, the most exciting colours a grieving woman can legally enjoy. The whole performance stretches across roughly 2 years for a widow, and heaven help you if you rush it, because the neighbours are watching and keeping careful score, and it does not end with widows. There are prescribed mourning periods for a parent, a child, a sibling, a grandparent, even distant cousins and in-laws, each with its own approved duration. Keep several relatives dying at inconvenient intervals, which in your century is entirely normal, and you could plausibly spend most of your adult life dressed for a graveside. An entire industry rises to feed all this sorrow. grand mourning warehouses open in the city, enormous shops devoted solely to the business of grief, where you can outfit an entire household in correct black at a moment's notice. There are black-edged handkerchiefs, black-edged writing paper, black gloves, black fans and mourning brooches. Mirrors are draped, clocks are sometimes stopped at the hour of death, and the poor stretch themselves to the breaking point trying to keep up appearances, because looking too cheerful too soon marks you as heartless. So yes, in your century, sorrow comes with an instruction manual, a shopping list, and a strict schedule. You do not simply feel sad and quietly carry on. You purchase the correct fabric, observe the correct timeline, and grieve strictly by the approved calendar. And if you happen to genuinely enjoy wearing black, congratulations. You were born in exactly the right century for it. Since you're already dressed head to toe in mourning, you may as well accessorize. And in your century, the most heartfelt accessory of all is made from the actual hair of your dead loved one. Locks are saved, cleaned, and painstakingly braided, coiled, and woven into brooches, rings, bracelets, and lockets, sometimes by professional hair artists and sometimes by grieving family members at the kitchen table. The idea is genuinely touching in theory, a piece of the departed kept close to your heart forever. In practice, you're wearing a bracelet made partly of your grandmother, and you consider this perfectly normal. You might even swap hairwork pieces with close friends, because nothing says lasting devotion like a small keepsake woven from somebody else. The logic behind it is actually rather sweet if you can get past the obvious. Hair is intimate, personal, and unmistakably part of one specific human being. Better still, it does not rot. Skin fades and bodies decay, but a lock of hair looks exactly the same in 50 years as it did on the day it was cut. To a century drowning in death and desperate to hold on to the people it keeps losing, a piece of hair is the closest thing to keeping someone with you always. It is a relic, a memory, and a fashion statement all braided into one. The craft itself is genuinely impressive. Skilled hair artists can take a tangle of human hair and turn it into astonishing things. Delicate woven bracelets, tiny flowers set under glass, looping watch chains for a gentleman, whole miniature landscapes assembled from carefully arranged strands. Ladies' magazines print patterns and instructions so you can attempt it yourself at home, gathered around the table with your sisters, weaving the hair of a departed relative into a keepsake the way another age might do a jigsaw puzzle. It is considered a wholesome, respectable, thoroughly ladylike pastime. But here is where it turns a little dark and a little funny. Sending your precious hair off to a professional workshop involves an uncomfortable leap of faith. There is a persistent and entirely reasonable worry that the workshop, handling great heaps of hair from countless grieving customers, might simply lose track of yours and hand back a lovely finished brooch woven from the hair of a total stranger. Imagine grieving tenderly over a locket, kissing it each night, and quietly wearing the hair of some anonymous person you never met. The anxiety was real enough that people fretted about it openly, which tells you just how ordinary the whole practice had become. And it was not only for the dead. Hairwork was also exchanged between the living as a token of love and friendship. A young man might carry a lock of his sweetheart's hair woven into his watch chain. Friends traded braided keepsakes the way we might swap friendship bracelets. Even Queen Victoria, that patron saint of Victorian mourning, treasured jewellery made from Albert's hair and kept reminders of him against her skin. When the Queen herself is wearing her dead husband, the whole nation feels rather less strange about wearing theirs. Walk into a fashionable parlour of your century, and you may well be surrounded by hair you cannot even see. In the brooch on that lady's collar, in the ring on that gentleman's finger, in the framed wreath hanging proudly on the wall, woven from the hair of 3 generations of one family. It is everywhere, quietly, lovingly, unsettlingly present. So the next time you find a stray hair in your dinner and recoil in horror, remember that a Victorian would have gently picked it up, considered its sentimental value, and possibly commissioned a brooch. One person's contamination is another person's keepsake. Try not to think too hard about the family wreath. With so much death surrounding you, a new and rather specific fear begins to bloom. What if they bury you before you're actually finished being alive? Medicine in your century is not always confident about the difference between deeply unconscious and genuinely dead, and stories circulate, a few of them true and most of them wildly exaggerated, of coffins open to reveal scratch marks on the inside of the lid. The Victorians, being both deeply anxious and endlessly inventive, respond to this dread with technology. Enterprising minds patent safety coffins fitted with bells, breathing tubes, little flags, and cords you could pull from 6 feet under to alert the living that a dreadful mistake has been made. Whether a single soul was ever actually rescued this way is doubtful, but you can purchase the peace of mind, and in your century peace of mind comes with a bell on a string. To be fair to your terrified ancestors, this fear was not entirely irrational. Doctors of the age had no reliable way to confirm death. There was no machine to check the heart, no simple certain test. A physician pressed an ear to the chest, held a mirror or a feather to the lips and made his best guess. That leaves a worrying amount of room for error, especially with conditions that mimic death alarmingly well. A deep coma, a fainting fit, certain illnesses, and even a heavy dose of laudanum could all leave a living person cold, pale, still, and apparently gone. Then there were the epidemics. When disease swept through, victims were sometimes buried in a great and fearful hurry to stop the spread, which only fed the nightmare that somebody, somewhere, was being sealed into the ground while merely unconscious. Add a healthy diet of gothic horror stories in which unfortunate souls wake screaming in the dark beneath the earth, and you have a population genuinely losing sleep over the whole grim possibility. So the inventors got to work, and their solutions are magnificent. The safety coffin becomes a small industry of hope and dread. Some designs run a cord from the corpse's hand up through the earth to a bell mounted above the grave, so that the faintest twitch of a not-quite-dead finger would set it ringing across the cemetery. Others add breathing tubes to supply fresh air, little flags that pop up as a signal, or even glass panels so a passing groundskeeper might notice movement below. One particularly elaborate design promised that any motion of the chest would trigger a whole cascade of alarms above ground. Picture the scene this all imagines. A quiet graveyard at midnight, a sudden, frantic jingling rising from beneath a fresh mound of earth, and a cemetery watchman, who signed up for a nice peaceful job, now sprinting for a shovel while questioning every decision that led him to this moment. It is the stuff of pure nightmare, and your century built actual products around it. Here is the deflating truth, though. There is no confirmed case of a safety coffin ever actually saving anyone. The bells that rang were almost always set off by a body naturally settling and shifting as it, well, did what bodies quietly do. More than one hopeful watchman surely bolted toward a ringing grave only to find the occupant exactly as dead as before, just a little more rearranged. But the coffins sold anyway, because they were never truly about rescue. They were about comfort, about being able to lie down at night without picturing your own frantic fingernails scrabbling at a wooden lid. In a century that could not quite promise you were properly dead before it buried you, a bell on a string was the next best thing. Sweet dreams. Do keep one hand near the cord. Let us step back inside and admire your lovely home, and in particular that gorgeous green wallpaper. It is a rich, vivid, almost glowing shade of green, the most fashionable colour of the age, and it is achieved using a pigment made with arsenic. On a dry day, it simply looks beautiful. On a damp day, which in England is most days, the paper can release arsenic into the air, and slowly, quietly, your cheerful sitting room becomes a low-effort poisoning device. Families complain of headaches, stomach trouble, and mysterious illnesses that improve the moment they leave the house and return the moment they come back. Nobody connects the dots for a very long time because surely something as tasteful and expensive as wallpaper would never dream of trying to kill you. The colour at the heart of all this trouble is a brilliant green so lovely that people simply cannot get enough of it. It appears decades earlier and quickly becomes the shade to have, splashed across wallpaper, curtains, and painted surfaces in every fashionable home. The problem is that its dazzling greenness comes courtesy of a compound loaded with arsenic, and your century adores the look so much that it plasters the stuff across the very rooms where families eat, sleep, and raise their children. For a while, everything seems perfectly fine. The trouble reveals itself slowly and it favours damp conditions, which England provides in bottomless supply. In a humid room, or wherever mould takes hold behind the paper, the arsenic can be transformed and released as a poisonous vapour, a faint, invisible menace drifting through the air you breathe all night long. You cannot see it, you cannot clearly smell it, you simply feel unwell in your own home and cannot for the life of you fathom why. The pattern of sickness is maddeningly consistent once you know to look for it. Children in a green nursery grow pale, listless, and ill. Whole families suffer sore throats, stomach cramps, headaches, and a creeping, bone-deep exhaustion. And then, tellingly, they recover while away on holiday or visiting relatives, only to sicken all over again the moment they return to their beautiful, deadly parlour. Doctors puzzle over it, and some of them slowly arrive at the horrible truth. The fashionable room itself is the culprit. What makes the whole affair even more Victorian is the fierce denial that follows. When alarms are raised about arsenic in wallpaper, plenty of respectable people simply refuse to believe it. One of the most famous wallpaper designers of the entire age, whose family fortune was tied up in arsenic mining, brushed off the danger completely, insisting the fears were nonsense and that people were frightening themselves over nothing. It is difficult to accept that your gorgeous, expensive, tasteful decor might be quietly poisoning your children, so a great many people simply decline to accept it and keep hanging the lovely green paper. Eventually, the evidence piles too high to ignore, and a market slowly emerges for wallpapers proudly advertised as free from arsenic, which tells you everything about how normal the poisonous kind had become. Imagine a world where you must specifically request the wallpaper that will not harm you, and the safe version is the strange novelty. So there you sit, in your handsome sitting room, admiring the walls, sipping your tea, feeling a touch under the weather and blaming the draught. The colour is magnificent, the pattern is the envy of the neighbourhood, and the whole time, in the quiet damp behind the paper, your decor is very gently trying to see you off. In your century, taste and toxicity are frequently the exact same shade of green. Do try not to lick the walls. The wallpaper is only the beginning, because your century is having a full-blown love affair with arsenic. That same poisonous green tints, fake flowers, fabrics and ball gowns, so vivid they practically hum, which is unfortunate news for the women wearing them, and far worse news for the workers making them. Arsenic turns up in cheap sweets when a careless confectioner reaches for the wrong white powder and accidentally poisons an entire batch of candy. It is sold openly at the chemist for killing rats, and it is quietly folded into complexion wafers that promise to make your skin pale and flawless. And it works, in a manner of speaking. Nothing gives you that delicate, fashionable, ghostly pallor quite like a mild and ongoing case of poisoning. Consider the ballroom first. The most fashionable green gowns of the age are coloured with arsenic, and they are stunning, glowing under the gaslight like something enchanted. But as the dancers whirl and sweat and brush against one another, that green dye sheds a fine, toxic dust into the air. It settles on skin, drifts into lungs, and rubs off onto partners. There is even a grim nickname for this glittering, poisonous dance, and the women wearing the gowns often broke out in rashes and sores where the fabric touched their skin. Now spare a real thought for the people who make these things, because they suffer far worse than the wearers. The young women who assemble fashionable artificial flowers and leafy green wreaths handle arsenic-laced material all day long, dusting the vivid green powder onto petals with their bare hands. They breathe it. They touch their food with it. They carry it home under their fingernails. One such artificial flower maker died from this very work, her body ravaged by the poison, her death held up by campaigners as a horrifying public warning. She was young. Her job was making pretty green leaves for fashionable ladies. It killed her. Then there is the candy. In one infamous incident, a sweet maker sends someone to fetch a cheap white powder commonly used to bulk out sweets and stretch the costly sugar. Through a chain of careless errors, what actually gets mixed into the batch is arsenic. The poisoned sweets are sold at a busy market stall, and before long a great many people fall violently ill, and a shocking number die, including children who simply bought themselves a treat. It is a genuine mass poisoning, caused not by malice but by the casual, everywhere availability of a deadly poison and a total absence of care. And people do not only get poisoned by accident, some cheerfully poison themselves on purpose, in small doses, for beauty. Arsenic complexion wafers are sold as a reliable path to that coveted pale, translucent, delicate skin, and fashionable people actually eat them. There is even a widely used arsenic-based tonic prescribed by doctors for all manner of complaints. In your century, a little arsenic is medicine, cosmetic, and cause of death, all at once, depending entirely on the dose and your luck. You can buy it almost anywhere. It looks exactly like flour or sugar. It has no strong taste. It is used to kill rats, and, with alarming frequency, to quietly kill inconvenient spouses, which keeps the newspapers busy with sensational poisoning trials. Laws eventually try to rein it in, requiring poisons to be coloured and buyers to sign a register. But for most of your century, arsenic is simply part of daily life, sitting there in the pantry, the wardrobe, the sweet shop, and the medicine chest. So enjoy the ball, admire the flowers, and have a sweet by all means. Just perhaps not all three in the same evening. In your century, beauty really is to die for. Speaking of pale and flawless, let us sit down at the vanity and get ready for the day, assuming the day does not get you first. The fashionable look is soft, pale, and untouched by anything as vulgar as sunlight or manual labour. To achieve it, some women dust their faces with powders containing lead, which does whiten the skin beautifully right up until it damages it permanently. Others drip tinctures of belladonna, a genuine poison, into their eyes to make the pupils large and dreamy, trading a small thing like clear eyesight for a fashionably wide-eyed stare. There are lip and cheek tints of deeply questionable origin, and creams best not examined too closely. In your century, suffering for beauty is not a charming figure of speech. It is a real medical risk with a lovely finish. The obsession begins with skin, and specifically with being pale. A tan means you labour outdoors like a common field worker, and nothing horrifies a respectable lady quite so much as looking useful. So the ideal complexion is white, smooth, and faintly luminous, as though you've never once stepped into daylight or done a hard day's anything. The trouble is that real skin refuses to cooperate, so it must be persuaded, and the persuasion is frequently toxic. Lead is the old, reliable villain here. Face powders and paints made with white lead give the skin a flawless, poreless finish that fashionable women find irresistible. What the advertisements leave out is that lead absorbed steadily through the skin causes very real harm over time, leaving the complexion damaged, roughened and grey underneath the paint. And here is the cruel trap. The worse your skin gets from the lead, the more lead you slap on to hide the damage, and the more damage you do. It is a beauty routine that quietly consumes the very face it is meant to perfect. Some women take things further with a process of enamelling, a full coating of paste applied to create a smooth, doll-like surface meant to last for days. It looks impressive from clear across a room, up close, or when the wearer makes the terrible mistake of smiling or frowning. The whole polished mask is prone to cracking, and reapplying it means layering fresh paint over skin that never gets properly cleaned underneath. Glamorous is one word for it. Then we come to the eyes, and to belladonna, whose very name means beautiful woman. This is deadly nightshade, a plant so poisonous it can kill, and fashionable women drip diluted preparations of it directly into their eyes. Why? Because it widens the pupils, creating that large, dark, dreamy look considered enormously attractive. The catch, and it is a considerable catch, is that it also blurs your vision, makes bright light painful, and with repeated use can genuinely damage your eyesight. You would look absolutely captivating and be entirely unable to read the invitation you were captivating people at. The irony threaded through all of this is delicious. Your century officially frowns upon obvious cosmetics. Visible paint and rouge are associated with actresses and women of low repute, so a respectable lady must never appear to be wearing makeup at all. The goal is to look effortlessly, naturally beautiful. And to achieve that natural, untouched look, women are eating chalk, sipping vinegar, painting on lead, and dropping poison into their own eyeballs. The most natural-looking face in the room is often the most chemically assaulted. So take your seat at the mirror and choose your poison, quite literally. Pale skin from lead, bright eyes from nightshade, a complexion maintained through slow and steady chemical warfare. You will look absolutely radiant. You may not be able to see it, and it may be gently killing you, but you will look radiant. In your century, that is considered a perfectly fair trade. Now to get dressed properly, which begins with the corset. You have heard the wild stories, fainting women, ribs rearranged, internal organs relocated to entirely new addresses. The reality is a good deal calmer and quite a bit more interesting. Most women wore corsets simply as everyday support and structure, the way you might wear a firm, supportive undergarment, and they went about their lives, worked, walked, and breathed perfectly well. A smaller number practiced serious tight-lacing to achieve a dramatically tiny waist, and that could indeed cause discomfort, shortness of breath, and the occasional theatrical swoon. Doctors of the era adored warning about it, sometimes with real accuracy, and sometimes with the enthusiasm of men who simply enjoyed telling women what to do. Either way, your outfit has firm opinions about how much air you're permitted. Let us clear up what a corset actually is, because the popular picture is wildly overblown. It is a fitted undergarment, usually made of sturdy cotton or a tightly woven fabric, stiffened with strips of whalebone or, increasingly in your century, thin steel. It laces up, it shapes the torso, and it supports the bust and back. For the vast majority of women, it is simply the foundation you put on before your clothes, as ordinary and unremarkable as any other piece of underwear. Women wear them to work in factories, to scrub floors, to run entire households, and to chase children around, and they manage every bit of it without collapsing dramatically onto the nearest chaise. The corset also does jobs you might not expect. In an age before modern support garments, it holds everything in place, improves posture, helps carry the considerable weight of heavy Victorian skirts, and even offers back support for physical labour. Far from being a mere instrument of torture, for many women it is genuinely useful, which is precisely why nearly everyone wears one, from the grandest duchess to the hardest working maid. Now, the myths. The tale that women routinely had their lower ribs surgically removed to achieve a smaller waist is exactly that, a myth, with no real evidence behind it. Surgery in your century is a horrifying and often fatal affair, and no sane person is volunteering for elective rib removal to fit into a ball gown. What is true is that a minority of fashionable women practice tight lacing, cinching the corset down hard over months and years to train the waist ever smaller. Pushed to real extremes, this could genuinely restrict breathing, press on the internal organs, cause discomfort and digestive trouble, and yes, produce the occasional faint. But here is where you must be a careful listener, because the fainting has more than one cause. The fashionable lady of your century is expected to be delicate, frail and sensitive, so a well-timed swoon is practically a social skill, a way of signalling refined femininity. Some faints are the corset, some are the stuffy, overheated, overcrowded rooms, and some are pure theatre. Untangling which is which kept a great many Victorian gentlemen very busy being deeply concerned. The doctors, meanwhile, are having an absolute field day. Medical men write endlessly about the perils of the corset, and while some of their warnings about extreme lacing are perfectly valid, a great many are laced, if you will forgive me, with a heavy dose of moralising and a clear enthusiasm for lecturing women about their own bodies. A whole dress reform movement eventually rises up to argue for looser, more sensible clothing, with decidedly mixed success against the sheer brute force of fashion. So the truth sits comfortably in the middle. The corset is not the murderous torture device of legend, nor is it entirely harmless at its tightest extremes. It is mostly just underwear with strong opinions. Lace it gently, and you will be perfectly fine. Lace it like you are trying to win a bet, and you may want to stay within easy reach of that fainting couch. With the corset cinched, it is time for the crinoline, that enormous cage of hoops that holds your skirt out in a magnificent sweeping bell shape. It is the absolute height of fashion, and it is also a slow-moving disaster. The cage swings your skirt out wide, which means you can knock over furniture, block entire doorways, and lose all sense of where the edges of yourself actually are. Worse, you live in a world lit entirely by open flames, candles, gas lamps, and roaring fireplaces. A wide, drifting, highly flammable skirt floating past an open hearth is a tragedy simply waiting for its moment. And it happened often enough that fatal dress fires became a grimly familiar item in the newspapers. You look absolutely spectacular tonight. Please stay well away from the birthday cake. Oddly enough, the cage crinoline was originally invented as an improvement. Before it, achieving that fashionable full skirt meant piling on layer after layer of heavy petticoats, until a woman was effectively hauling around a small tent, hot, exhausting, and enormously heavy. The steel cage promised sweet freedom, the same grand silhouette, but light, airy, and letting the legs move underneath. On paper, it was a triumph of engineering. In practice, it swapped one set of problems for a far more exciting set. The first issue is simple physics. Your skirt now extends a tremendous distance in every direction, and you have very little sense of how much space you're actually occupying. Ladies knock ornaments clean off tables, get thoroughly wedged trying to pass through normal doorways, struggle to sit in ordinary chairs, and require what is essentially their own postal district on a crowded street. Two fashionable women approaching one another on a narrow pavement becomes a genuine navigational puzzle. Then there is the wind, which treats a crinoline like a sail. There are accounts of women being caught by strong gusts and quite literally blown over, tipped off their feet, or in truly unlucky cases swept off piers and cliff edges by their own billowing skirts. The very machine meant to make you elegant occasionally decides to make you airborne instead. But the truly deadly hazard is fire. Your world has no electric lighting. Every room is illuminated and heated by open flame, and the fashionable fabrics of the season, light muslins and gauzy weaves, catch fire with terrifying ease. Combine an enormous, swishing, wide skirt that you cannot fully feel with a room full of candles and grates, and disaster is only one careless step away. A woman turns too close to the fireplace, a hem brushes a stray candle, and in an instant the whole billowing garment is ablaze, with a rigid cage holding the burning fabric out and away from any hope of quickly smothering it. The toll was real and horrifying. Across the years of the fashion, a great many women died in dress fires, and among the victims were relatives of famous names, deaths that shocked society precisely because they were so sudden and so avoidable. The newspapers reported them with grim regularity. Flame-resistant treatments for fabric were proposed, but they proved unpopular, because they were thought to spoil the look and feel of the material, and looking good, as ever, quietly outranked staying alive. The satirists had a wonderful time with all of it, filling the comic papers with cartoons of women wedged in doorways, swallowing entire rooms with their skirts, and terrorizing hapless husbands. But behind the jokes was a genuinely dangerous garment that turned ordinary life into a low-grade hazard and the wrong evening into a fatal one. So there you stand, resplendent in your glorious swaying bell of a gown, taking up half the room and unable to feel your own perimeter. You're the most fashionable thing at the party. You're also, quite possibly, the most flammable. Do admire the candles from a safe distance. Let us give the gentlemen their moment, because the men of your century take their facial hair extraordinarily seriously. Enormous moustaches, sculpted sideburns, and beards of biblical proportions are treated as markers of health, wisdom, and manly authority. Keeping all of that hair magnificent requires effort and a good deal of wax, which creates a very particular and very Victorian problem. Sipping a hot drink can melt your carefully waxed moustache straight down into your tea. The solution, naturally, is an invention. The moustache cup features a small ledge, a little guard across the rim with an opening in it, that holds the moustache safely up and out of the liquid while the tea flows underneath. It is a real object, produced in great numbers, and it exists for the sole purpose of preventing a man's face from falling into his beverage. To appreciate the moustache cup, you first have to appreciate just how seriously your century takes the beard. Facial hair goes from optional to practically compulsory, helped along by soldiers returning from war sporting magnificent beards grown in the field, where shaving in freezing conditions was miserable and pointless. They come home as heroes, whiskers and all, and suddenly a full beard is the mark of a proper man. Doctors even chime in, gravely insisting that a good beard filters the air, protects the throat, and guards against illness. A clean-shaven face starts to look faintly suspicious, possibly even unhealthy. So the men commit, and they commit hard. Moustaches are grown long and curled at the tips. Sideburns are cultivated into sweeping mutton chops. Beards are coaxed into shapes with names and reputations. And keeping all this facial architecture in order becomes a genuine daily discipline, requiring wax to hold the curl, oils to keep it glossy, and no small amount of vanity to maintain the whole magnificent display. This is where the trouble brews, right there in the teacup. A gentleman lowers his lovingly waxed moustache toward a steaming cup of tea or coffee, and the heat does exactly what heat does to wax. The careful curl droops, the wax softens and runs. In the worst cases, a man who has dyed his whiskers finds the colour bleeding into his drink, and the whole grand effort of the morning dissolves into a sad, damp smear before lunchtime. For a century, this proud of its facial hair, this is a genuine crisis. Enter the moustache cup, credited to an enterprising potter who spotted a very specific problem and built a very specific solution. A little shelf is fixed across the inside of the cup near the rim, with a small opening at the front. The moustache rests safely on the shelf, held clear of the liquid, while the tea passes through the gap to the drinker's lips. The wax stays firm, the curl stays proud, and the beverage stays reassuringly free of stray whiskers. It is a triumph of dedicated, borderline absurd engineering aimed at a problem most centuries never even had. And the moustache cup does not travel alone. Your century produces an entire arsenal of facial hair equipment, devices to train and shape the moustache overnight, guards to wear while sleeping so the curl holds its form, curling tongs, dedicated combs, and cases of waxes and oils. There are even cups made specifically for left-handed gentlemen, because the ledge has to sit on the correct side, and a century this devoted to its whiskers is not about to leave the left-handed man to suffer. So picture him, a proud Victorian gentleman, whiskers waxed to a fine point, raising his special cup with its clever little shelf, sipping his tea without a single hair going astray. It is ridiculous. It is magnificent. It is a solid, functional object that a great many people bought, in complete sincerity, to protect a moustache. In your century, that is not eccentric at all. That is simply good grooming. Summer arrives, and with it the seaside, where your century approaches the simple act of getting into the ocean with the caution of a full military operation. Being seen on an open beach in a bathing costume, or heaven forbid partly undressed, is considered scandalous. So you rent a bathing machine, which is a small wooden hut mounted on large wheels. You climb inside fully clothed while it sits on the sand, change into your modest bathing outfit as the whole hut is wheeled directly into the sea by a horse or a very strong attendant, and then step out on the far side straight into the water, safely hidden from any prying eyes on the shore. When you're finished, the entire process runs in reverse. It is an enormous amount of effort spent protecting a modesty that a single gust of wind could ruin anyway. The seaside itself is having a moment. The railways now carry ordinary people to the coast in great cheerful crowds, and doctors enthusiastically prescribe sea air and cold salt water as a cure for practically everything, from weak nerves to poor digestion. So off you go for your health, only to discover that enjoying the ocean comes wrapped in a truly staggering amount of rules. Step inside the machine and take in the ambience. It is cramped, damp and dim, smelling of wet timber, salt and old seaweed, with a splintery bench and a tiny window. You wrestle out of your ordinary clothes and into your bathing costume, which for a lady covers very nearly everything, and is somehow expected to be worn while soaking wet in front of absolutely no one. Meanwhile, the whole hut lurches and rolls beneath you as it is dragged down the sand and out into the surf, so you're also getting changed inside a moving vehicle, which is its own small adventure. Then there is the dipper. At many resorts, sturdy attendants wait in the shallows, whose entire job is to seize timid bathers and plunge them bodily into the cold sea, ready or not, because a proper dunking is considered the healthful part. Imagine paying good money to have a powerful stranger march you into freezing water and shove you under for your own good. It is less a relaxing swim and more a supervised baptism you did not ask for. Modesty rules govern the whole beach. Men and women bathe in strictly separated areas, sometimes a great distance apart, and the boundaries are taken seriously enough to be written into local bylaws. This matters, because for much of the era plenty of men simply bathed with nothing on at all, which made a lady's machine drifting toward the wrong stretch of sand a genuine scandal in the making. Some resorts even rig a canvas hood over the seaward door so you can lower yourself into the water, completely screened from the world. The fashion gets a royal seal of approval too, because the Queen herself keeps a private bathing machine and takes her careful dips in the sea, which settles the matter of respectability once and for all. If it is good enough for Her Majesty, it is good enough for the nation. So there you are, having taken a train, rented a hut, been dragged into the ocean by a horse, and dunked by a stranger, all to enjoy a brief, chilly, fully clothed paddle before the whole circus reverses. Compare that to simply walking down to the water in your swimming things. In your century the sea is free, but reaching it modestly costs you your entire afternoon and most of your dignity anyway. Back on dry land, let us talk about how you communicate, because in your century even a simple bunch of flowers is a coded message. Society is bound by strict rules about what may and may not be said out loud, so people learn to speak through blooms instead. Red roses mean love, of course, but every single flower carries meaning, and so do the colours, the arrangement, and even whether you offer it with the right hand or the left. A carefully chosen bouquet can whisper devotion, hint gently at hope, or politely inform someone that you find them utterly repulsive, all without a single spoken word. Guidebooks fly off the shelves so that nobody accidentally confesses undying passion when they only meant to say get well soon. Flirting in your century has never felt quite so much like homework. The whole system is called the language of flowers, and your century adores it. Publishers race to print little dictionaries assigning a precise meaning to every bloom, leaf, and sprig, so that a thoughtfully assembled posy becomes a sentence, a paragraph, or in the case of an especially ambitious admirer, an entire love letter made of petals. A red tulip is a declaration of love, a yellow rose might hint at jealousy, rosemary is remembrance, ivy is fidelity, and a striped carnation is a polite but unmistakable no thank you. There is even grammar to it. Presenting a flower upside down is said to reverse its meaning, so a bloom that means devotion becomes rejection when flipped. Handing your bouquet over with the right hand can signal yes, while the left signals no. Where you tuck a flower, over the heart or in the hair, adds shades of meaning. A single carefully built nosegay, the little hand-held bouquet a lady carries, can therefore carry a whole coded conversation nobody else at the party can read. But here is the catch that makes the entire thing gloriously Victorian and gloriously doomed. There is no single agreed dictionary. Rival publishers cheerfully assign completely different meanings to the same flower, which means your heartfelt message only works if your beloved happens to own the exact same book you do. Picture a nervous suitor labouring for hours over a bouquet meant to say, "I adore you," and long for your hand, only for the young lady to consult her own different guide and conclude that he has just accused her of being conceited and possibly deceitful. It is a romantic communication system with no shared spelling. The nosegay had a second, less poetic purpose too. In a century where the streets and rivers could smell absolutely dreadful, a fragrant little bunch of flowers held near the nose was a very practical shield against the stench of everyday life. So your coded message of love was often doing double duty as air freshener, which rather undercuts the romance. You should also know that historians gently suspect the language of flowers was always as much a charming publishing craze and a bit of pretty parlour fun as it was a rigidly used secret code. Not every gentleman was fluent, and not every posy hid a message. But the Victorians loved the idea of it, the notion that a shy age with too many rules could still whisper the unsayable through a handful of blooms. So the next time someone hands you a bouquet, accept it graciously and resist the urge to decode it. In your century, a bunch of flowers might be devotion, might be an insult, and might simply be the only way anyone was allowed to flirt. Do check which dictionary they were using first. Your century does not do hobbies by halves, and for one remarkable stretch of years, the entire country loses its collective mind over ferns. It is called pterodomania, which translates roughly to fern madness, and it is every bit as ridiculous as it sounds. Respectable people trek out into the countryside to dig up wild ferns, cram them into elaborate glass cases in their parlours, and decorate absolutely everything they own with fern shapes, pottery, wallpaper, garden benches, and even custard moulds. Fern hunting becomes such an intense craze that some species are stripped clean from the wild by over-enthusiastic collectors. It is gardening pursued with the fervour of a religious revival, and you, naturally, own 3 fern books and 1 special glass box, and you consider yourself entirely reasonable about the whole thing. The word itself is coined by a well-known writer who looks around, notices young ladies everywhere seized by an all-consuming passion for ferns, and gives the affliction a suitably grand and slightly mocking name. An affliction is the right word because this is not a mild interest. This is a full national obsession, the sort of thing that grips a country, empties its wallets, and covers its shelves in feathery green fronds. Part of what sets it off is a clever invention, a sealed glass case that acts as a tiny indoor greenhouse. Someone discovers almost by accident that a fern sealed inside glass can thrive for ages, protected from the filthy, sooty, smoke-choked air of the industrial cities, where almost nothing green will grow. Suddenly, delicate ferns that would wither on a city windowsill can flourish in a pretty glass box in your parlour, and the craze has its perfect vehicle. Think of it as your century's version of the fashionable home aquarium or terrarium, except everyone has one and everyone will talk your ear off about it. Ferns turn out to be the ideal Victorian obsession for a few very Victorian reasons. They're green, graceful, and modest, with none of the showy, vulgar sensuality of big, bright flowers, which makes them entirely proper for delicate young ladies to pursue. They come in countless varieties that take real study to tell apart, which flatters the collector's sense of expertise, and they can be hunted, which brings us to the truly unhinged part. Fern hunting becomes a genuine sport. People board trains to the countryside armed with trowels, tins, and boundless enthusiasm, and they dig. They dig up ferns from riverbanks, hillsides, and woodland by the sackful, hauling home wild specimens to pot up at home or sell for profit. Whole stretches of countryside are stripped nearly bare, and some rarer ferns are collected almost to vanishing, all in the name of a parlour hobby. Professional fern sellers spring up to feed the frenzy, and then the fern motif escapes the garden entirely and colonises everyday objects. Ferns appear on pottery, glassware, textiles, cast iron railings, tea services, christening presents, and yes, moulds for shaping your dinner. People press ferns into albums, join fern clubs, and build dedicated corners of the garden called ferneries just to show off. For a while, you genuinely cannot escape ferns. Like all manias, it eventually cools, and the country slowly regains its senses and moves on to the next enthusiasm. But for a good long while, a sensible buttoned-up nation lost itself completely over some leafy woodland plants. So if you ever feel foolish about a hobby that took over your life, take comfort. An entire empire once went to war with the countryside over ferns, and felt terribly cultured doing it. With so much death in the air and so many grieving people wandering about, it is perhaps no surprise that your sentry becomes obsessed with contacting the other side. Spiritualism sweeps through parlours everywhere, and the séance becomes fashionable evening entertainment. Respectable men and women gather around a table in a darkened room, join hands, and wait for a medium to summon the spirits of the departed. Tables tilt and rap. Unseen hands seem to brush against shoulders, and mysterious messages are spelled out slowly, letter by letter. Some of those present are true believers desperately seeking comfort. Others are curious skeptics. And a fair number of the mediums are extremely talented performers, armed with hidden wires, clever feet, and a marvellous sense of theatre. Either way, chatting with your dead uncle after supper is a perfectly acceptable way to spend an evening. The whole movement kicks off with two young sisters across the ocean who claim they can speak with a spirit through mysterious knocking sounds, one rap for yes and two for no. The story spreads like wildfire, leaps the Atlantic, and lands in a country practically primed to believe it. Your sentry buries so many people, so young and so often, that the promise of one more word with a lost child or a dead husband is almost unbearably tempting. If a spirit can knock on a table, then perhaps death is not the end, and perhaps the ones you loved are only a séance away. The séance itself is pure theatre, and marvellous theatre at that. The curtains are drawn, the lamps turned low, and everyone joins hands around a table so no one can secretly interfere, or so they believe. The medium slips into a trance and calls out to the beyond. Then things begin to happen. The heavy table rocks and tilts. Sharp raps answer questions from somewhere in the dark. A cold touch grazes a shoulder. A message is spelled out painstakingly, letter by letter, and grieving guests weep as words arrive that only their departed loved one could possibly know. Some mediums go further still, producing floating instruments that play themselves, ghostly hands, spirit writing that appears on blank slates, and eventually full apparitions that drift through the gloom. A few celebrated performers become the toast of high society, invited into the grandest homes to summon the dead as the evening's entertainment. It is not fringe or shameful. It is fashionable, and even a number of serious scientific-minded people take it seriously and set out to investigate whether it might actually be real. Which brings us to the skeptics, who have a field day. Investigators catch mediums rapping with the joints of their toes under the table, tilting furniture with hidden knees, using long telescopic rods to make objects float, and sweathing themselves in gauze to play their own ghosts. Fraud after fraud is exposed, and yet it barely dents the movement, because a court medium simply packs up and reappears in a new town, and because the believers do not want to stop believing. Comfort is a powerful thing, and grief is patient. It is easy to laugh, and much of it deserves a gentle laugh. But underneath the toe cracking and the muslin ghosts sat a genuine human ache, the longing of ordinary people to hear one more time from someone they could not bear to lose. Modern life has its own ways of chasing that same feeling. Your sentry simply did it in a darkened parlour, holding hands, waiting for the table to knock. So take your seat, join the circle and listen. Just try not to look too closely at the medium's feet. You probably think of Valentine's Day as something sweet, but your sentry has invented a special way to weaponize it entirely. Alongside the lovely lacy cards brimming with romance, there is a thriving trade in vinegar valentines. Cheap, cruel, insulting cards sent anonymously to people you cannot stand. Each one features a crude little cartoon and a nasty rhyming verse mocking the recipient for being ugly, foolish, drunk, desperate, a nag, a terrible cook, or simply alive. You buy one, send it off without any signature, and the poor victim often has to pay the postage to receive their own insult. It is petty, it is cowardly, and it is wildly popular across every level of society. Nothing quite says romance like paying a penny to inform a stranger that their nose is enormous. To understand how this got so out of hand, you first have to understand that your century goes absolutely wild for Valentine cards in general. Cheap printing and a new affordable postal system mean that ordinary people can suddenly send pretty cards by the millions, and they do, drowning the post office in lace, hearts, and sentimental verse every February. It is a genuine craze, and where there is a wholesome craze, your century can always be trusted to invent a mean-spirited version alongside it. The Vinegar Valentine is that version. It is cheap, garish, and single-minded in its cruelty. At the top sits a crude cartoon exaggerating some flaw, and beneath it a short, biting verse designed to wound. There is a card for every irritating person in your life. There is one for the vain young man and one for the flirt. There is one for the old maid and one for the confirmed bachelor. There is one for the nosy neighbour, the stingy employer, the drunkard, the henpecked husband, the gossip, and the tradesman you feel overcharged you. Whatever your grievance, some publisher has printed the perfect insult and stacked it by the till. The cruelty is sharpened by the anonymity. You send the thing unsigned, so the victim has no idea who despises them enough to spend money saying so. And in a particularly cutting twist of the postal arrangements of the day, the recipient could be the one left to pay to receive the insult, handing over their own coin for the privilege of being told they are hideous. It is an insult with a delivery charge attached, and the sender never has to show their face. These cards were not always harmless fun either. Some were genuinely vicious, and they landed on real people who took them badly. There are accounts of them causing bitter arguments, wounded feelings, and worse, because a cruel message hits just as hard whether it arrives by pixel or by post. Your century, for all its lace and manners, could be breathtakingly nasty when handed an anonymous outlet. And that is really the striking thing about the whole business. If you have ever wondered whether anonymous cruelty is some modern invention, some fresh sickness of the connected age, your century would like to gently correct you. Give people a way to insult one another without consequences, and they will absolutely take it, top hats and crinolines and all. The technology has changed. The impulse is depressingly ancient. So on the morning of the 14th, as the post arrives, you open your envelope with a flutter of hope, expecting lace and devotion. Instead, you unfold a cartoon of yourself with an enormous nose and a rhyme about your dreadful cooking, sent by a person unknown. Postage kindly paid by you. Happy Valentine's Day. Somebody out there was thinking of you, unfortunately. Now for a decorating choice that will genuinely haunt your dreams. Your century adores taxidermy, and one particular craftsman takes it into gloriously strange territory by posing stuffed animals as though they were tiny people living tiny lives. Picture kittens in frilly dresses attending a formal wedding, rabbits seated at little school desks, and squirrels gathered around a table for a friendly game of cards, all of them real animals, preserved and arranged into elaborate miniature scenes. These displays are admired, exhibited, and considered perfectly charming family entertainment. Nobody finds it the least bit unsettling that every single guest at the kitten wedding is extremely dead. In fact, people queue up in the rain to see it. You will hang some stuffed something in your own parlour, believe it adds a real touch of class, and by the standards of your century, it genuinely does. To be fair, taxidermy is everywhere in your century, and most of it is far more ordinary than a kitten in a wedding gown. The Empire is shipping home exotic creatures from every corner of the globe, and a fashionable parlour is not complete without a glass dome of stuffed songbirds, a mounted trophy from a hunt, or a stern-looking preserved fish above the mantel. Preserving the dead and displaying them proudly is simply part of tasteful decorating, and everyone is at it. The craze for the human scene version gets a tremendous boost from a grand national exhibition, where an enormous display of little stuffed animals dressed and posed in charming human tableaux delights the enormous crowds, and even earns the admiration of the Queen. Once royalty has cooed over a stoat in a waistcoat, the whole nation feels perfectly comfortable finding it delightful too, and the fashion is set. But the true master of the form runs his own museum, and his work has to be seen to be believed. His masterpiece is a kitten's wedding, featuring dozens of preserved kittens dressed in tiny handmade outfits, the bride in her little gown, the groom in his little suit, guests seated in rows, all attending a solemn ceremony that none of them are in any condition to enjoy. Elsewhere he builds a schoolroom full of studious rabbits at miniature desks, guinea pigs playing a spirited game of cricket, and other elaborate scenes assembled with astonishing care, real fur, glass eyes, tiny furniture, and endless patience. Now, the question you're politely not asking: where did all the animals come from? A good deal of the time, from the ordinary business of country life, where unwanted litters and farmyard deaths were simply a fact, and villagers would pass the small bodies along to the man who turned them into art. It is a detail your century does not dwell on, and you probably should not either, right before bed. The appeal, oddly enough, is sentimental rather than sinister. These scenes tell little stories, sweet and whimsical and gently comic, the sort of thing that makes families smile and children press their noses to the glass. And there is a tenderness to the wider fashion too, because grieving pet owners often had beloved cats and dogs preserved, so they need never quite say goodbye, keeping a favourite companion by the fireside forever, if a touch stiffer than before. So by the standards of your century, hanging a preserved creature in your parlour or admiring a tiny stuffed wedding party is not macabre at all. It is charming. It is artful. It is a lovely day out for the whole family. You will smile, buy a postcard, and think nothing of it. And somewhere, in a glass case, several dozen kittens will smile stiffly back, forever caught mid-ceremony, forever the best-dressed guests at the strangest wedding in your century. If a stuffed kitten wedding feels a little tame for your particular social circle, your century has an even stranger evening on offer. Wealthy hosts riding a great wave of fascination with ancient Egypt sometimes purchase a genuine mummy and unwrap it in front of their guests as the highlight of a dinner party. Everyone gathers eagerly around, drinks in hand, while layer after layer of ancient linen is carefully peeled away, to reveal the preserved body of a person who lived thousands of years ago and very much did not agree to any of this. Amulets tucked into the wrappings are handed out afterward as party souvenirs. The whole thing is treated as science, spectacle and parlour trick all at once. You would attend, applaud politely, help yourself to another drink and go home feeling terribly cultured. Your century is utterly infatuated with ancient Egypt. Ever since European expeditions began prying open its tombs and shipping its treasures back across the sea, the whole continent has caught a fever for all things Egyptian. There are grand museum exhibitions, ancient obelisks hauled home and planted in city squares, jewellery and furniture, and even entire buildings styled after the pyramids and temples. It is fashionable, it is exotic, and it is, unfortunately for the ancient dead, extremely collectible. And here is the truly astonishing part. Mummies are not rare or precious in the way you might expect. For a traveller visiting Egypt, buying one is disturbingly easy and often cheap. A grim souvenir to bring home alongside the scarab jewellery and the sketches of the Sphinx. Ancient human beings carefully preserved by their own people to last for eternity, are sold as curiosities and packed off to gather dust in the drawing rooms of the well-to-do. Once you own one, what do you do with it? You unwrap it, of course, ideally in front of an audience. This begins with a famous antiquarian who holds unrollings as ticketed public lectures, part genuine study of the ancient body beneath, part pure showmanship before packed and fascinated crowds. From there, the idea trickles down into private homes, where a host with a mummy and a taste for the dramatic can turn an evening into an unforgettable event. Picture the scene. The guests are fed and watered, the lamps are bright, and the long-dead guest of honour is laid out on the table. The host peels away the ancient linen bandages, one wrapping at a time, narrating as he goes, while the company leans in with delighted horror. Tucked among the wrappings are amulets, charms, and small treasures, placed there thousands of years ago by mourners who believed they would protect the soul on its journey. These are plucked out and passed around, admired, and handed to guests to keep. You might go home with a genuine ancient charm in your pocket, a party favour stolen from a stranger's eternity. And the indignities did not stop at the unwrapping. Ground-up mummy was used to make a particular brown pigment beloved by some painters, meaning that the ancient dead occasionally ended up smeared across a landscape painting hanging in a gallery. Bits were used in dubious medicine. The whole civilization of the dead was treated as raw material for the amusement and industry of the living. Not a single person at your dinner party pauses to consider that the individual on the table was once a living human with a name, a family, and every expectation of resting undisturbed forever. In your century, that reflection simply does not occur. It is science. It is spectacle. It is a marvellous evening. So do help yourself to another drink, pocket your souvenir amulet, and admire your host's impeccable taste. Just spare a thought, perhaps, for the guest who never chose to attend. Popular entertainment in your century has a distinctly darker edge, and one of its biggest draws is the Human Curiosity exhibition. For the price of admission, crowds file slowly past people put on display for their differences. Unusual heights, rare conditions or talents billed grandly as marvels of nature. Some of these performers are exploited outright, paraded like objects with very little say in the matter. Others become genuine celebrities in their own right, negotiate their own contracts, earn real money, and are treated as stars of the age. The entire business sits somewhere deeply uncomfortable between wonder, cruelty, and commerce, and your century does not spend a single second worrying about that distinction. It is simply a fine day out, a spectacle, a story to tell the neighbours. Compassion, much like indoor plumbing, is still very much a work in progress. These exhibitions are found everywhere, from the travelling fairs that roll into country towns to the seaside shows and the permanent exhibition halls of the great cities. Outside, painted banners promise astonishing sights. A showman works the gathering crowd with a stream of grand and exaggerated patter, and for a coin you file inside to look upon a person whose body or condition has been turned into the attraction. It is important to sit honestly with what this was, because it does not deserve to be laughed at. For many of the people on display, this was exploitation in its plainest form. Individuals with disabilities or rare medical conditions, some of them desperately poor and some of them effectively controlled by managers who kept the profits, were put before staring crowds with little say over how they were shown or what they were called. Their dignity depended almost entirely on the character of whoever was in charge of them, and on how little choice they had been left with in life. And yet the picture is genuinely complicated, because that is not the whole of it. Some performers navigated this strange world with real shrewdness and came out as wealthy, famous, and admired public figures. There were stars who negotiated their own terms, toured widely, drew enormous crowds, amassed real fortunes, and were received in the finest houses in the land, right up to royalty itself. For a fortunate and canny few, this stage that exploited others became a path to independence and celebrity that the ordinary world would never have offered them. What is striking is that none of this was hidden away in the shadows or considered shameful. It was mainstream, respectable entertainment, enjoyed by every level of society. The same crowds who attended lectures and admired paintings also happily paid to stare at another human being, and the practice was endorsed at the very top, with the great and the good in attendance. Nobody thought twice. Only slowly toward the later years of your century did a quiet unease begin to grow. Reformers started to question the whole business, and the story of at least one man whose profound suffering and mistreatment became so public that it moved the nation, helped prick the conscience of the age and shift attitudes towards something gentler and more humane. So when you file past the exhibition and drop your coin in the showman's hand, understand what you are really taking part in. You are part of a crowd that has decided a fellow human being is a spectacle, and you have paid for the privilege of staring. Your century sees only a marvel and an afternoon's amusement. It will take a long time and a great deal of growing up before it learns to see a person instead. Tonight at least you can know better. Let us open the medicine cabinet, and please do brace yourself. In your century, opium is legal, cheap, and available at any corner chemist with no prescription and no questions asked. It comes as laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed into alcohol, and thoroughly respectable people take it for coughs, aches, frayed nerves, sleeplessness, and ordinary difficult Tuesdays. Most alarming of all, it turns up in soothing syrups marketed for fussy, teething babies, sold with cheerful labels and gentle, comforting promises. The syrups work extremely well, in the sense that they quiet the baby by dosing it with opiates. Parents give it out freely, often with no real idea what is truly in the bottle, and the outcomes range from a peaceful nap to genuine heartbreak. It is one of the darker corners of a century that seem to have a remedy and a hidden danger for absolutely everything. Start with just how ordinary opium is. It is not tucked away behind a doctor's desk or whispered about in back rooms. You can buy it from the chemist, the grocer, and the corner shop, a pennyworth at a time, as casually as you would buy tea or soap. In some damp, marshy parts of the country, taking opium is so routine that whole communities rely on it to get through the aches and agues of daily life. It is woven into the fabric of the age, and it is prescribed, or rather self-prescribed, for practically everything: a cough, a toothache, a sleepless night, a sore stomach, an anxious mind, a hard day. All of it can be met with a few drops of laudanum. It genuinely does dull pain and brings sleep, which is exactly why it is so trusted and so overused. People come to lean on it, and quietly, steadily, many of them come to depend on it, sliding into an addiction that the age barely has a word for. Then there are the soothing syrups, and this is where the story turns truly grim. These are branded products, cheerfully named and prettily labelled, sold specifically to quiet crying, teething, restless infants. They are aimed squarely at exhausted mothers and at the minders who watch other people's children while the parents work long hours, and they are laced with opium or morphine. A dose sends the baby into a deep, peaceful, welcome silence, and a worn-out household finally gets some rest. The trouble is that this silence is not comfort, it is sedation, and the dangers are severe. There is no reliable strength from one bottle to the next, so a dose that soothes one day can be far too much the next. The drugs suppress a baby's appetite, so a quiet, sedated infant may simply stop feeding and slowly waste, and overdoses take a real and terrible toll. The coroners of your century record these small deaths, and the numbers are not small. It is a sorrow that hides inside a product sold as kindness, and it is best spoken of plainly rather than joked about. Eventually the law begins to catch up, and rules arrive to restrict who can sell these powerful drugs and how they must be labelled. But that reckoning comes late, long after the syrups have done their quiet damage in countless homes. So as you stand before your century's medicine cabinet, take a good look at what respectable, ordinary, well-meaning families kept on the shelf. Compare it to a modern pharmacy, with its warnings and its locked cabinets and its questions. Your century had a cure for everything, sold with a smile and no questions at all. It simply did not always mention the price, and too often it was the smallest and most helpless who paid it. If the opium does not fix you, do not despair, because your century runs an entire booming industry of miracle cures waiting patiently to take your money. Electricity is new, thrilling, and barely understood, which makes it the perfect thing to sell as medicine. Enterprising quacks market electric belts, galvanic bands, and gently buzzing contraptions, promising to restore lost vigour, banish exhaustion, and fix delicate problems no gentleman would ever name out loud. There are pills for every conceivable ailment, tonics quietly laced with alcohol or cocaine, and bracelets that claim to hum your troubles away. Most of it does nothing whatsoever beyond lightening your purse, and a fair amount of it is actively harmful. But the advertising is glorious, the promises are gloriously bold, and hope, as it always has, sells a great deal better than honesty ever could. To be fair to the buyers, they are in a bind. Proper medicine in your century is expensive, frequently useless, and sometimes more dangerous than the illness. Doctors bleed you, dose you with mercury, and cannot cure most of what ails you anyway. So when a cheap bottle or a clever device promises to fix everything with no lancet and no leeches, an awful lot of desperate, aching people are more than willing to give it a try. Who could blame them? The electric belt is a perfect example of the age's genius for turning excitement into profit. Electricity is the miracle of the era, mysterious and powerful and associated with the very energy of life itself. So naturally someone straps it around your waist and calls it medicine. You buckle on a belt fitted with elements meant to deliver a mild, tingling current to your body, and the advertisements assure you it will restore your vitality, banish your nervous exhaustion, cure your aches, and quietly repair that unspecified loss of manly vigour that no respectable gentleman would ever discuss aloud. It tingles. It probably does nothing else. But it tingles convincingly, and that feels like something working. Then there is the great flood of patent medicines, the bottled cure-alls that fill every newspaper and shop window. A single tonic might claim to cure coughs, weak nerves, poor digestion, baldness, and consumption all at once, its secret formula known only to its maker. And the secret, more often than not, is that the bottle is generously loaded with alcohol, opium, or cocaine, so you do feel wonderful for a little while, right up until you feel considerably worse and need to buy another. What truly powers all of this is not the medicine but the advertising, and here your century breaks genuinely new ground. This is the dawn of mass advertising, with bold newspaper notices, glowing testimonials from grateful customers who may or may not exist, dramatic before and after tales, and mail order so you can be separated from your money without even leaving the house. The claims are spectacular, and there is nobody policing whether a single word of them is true. The devices multiply into a whole strange menagerie. There are magnetic rings, galvanic bands, medicated corsets, and electric hairbrushes, each promising health through some vaguely scientific-sounding force. Some are merely useless, others thick with mercury or lead or arsenic, are quietly doing you real harm while claiming to heal you. So step right up and choose your miracle. A belt that buzzes, a tonic that glows, a bracelet that hums your sorrows away, all backed by the most confident promises money can print. In your century, the cure almost never works, but the salesmanship is immortal. And if any of this sounds familiar the next time a modern miracle promises to fix everything you have ever worried about, well, your ancestors would like you to know they saw it first, and they bought the belt. While the doctors happily experiment on your body, an entirely different set of experts wants to get their hands on your head. Phrenology is the wildly popular belief that the precise shape of your skull, every bump, ridge and hollow, reveals your true character, your intelligence, and your hidden tendencies. A phrenologist runs their fingers over your scalp as though reading a very lumpy map, then confidently announces that you possess a strong bump of caution, a sadly underdeveloped region of kindness, or a rather worrying natural talent for crime. People take all of this seriously enough to consult phrenologists about careers, marriages, and exactly whom they ought to trust. It is complete and utter nonsense dressed in the calm, confident language of science, which, as it turns out, is a combination your century finds absolutely irresistible. The theory behind it sounds almost reasonable until you poke it. The idea is that the brain is not one single lump, but a collection of separate little organs, each responsible for one specific quality, one for affection, one for combativeness, one for greed, one for reverence, and so on through several dozen faculties. The more you exercise a particular quality, the theory goes, the larger its organ grows, and a large enough organ supposedly pushes out the skull above it into a telltale bump. Feel the bumps, the reasoning runs, and you can read the mind beneath them like a shopping list. A respected anatomist first proposes the notion, an enthusiastic disciple tours the country preaching it, and before long a book explaining it all becomes one of the runaway bestsellers of the age. Suddenly, phrenology is everywhere. There are phrenological societies, phrenological journals, and those famous pale ceramic heads, marked all over with neat little labelled regions, sitting on desks and shop counters like the mascot of the whole strange enterprise. Getting your head read becomes a genuine service you pay for. The phrenologist works methodically over your scalp with practiced fingers, murmuring findings, filling out a detailed chart of your character, and handing you a written analysis of who you supposedly are. And people act on it. Employers feel the heads of job applicants to judge their honesty. Anxious parents have their children read to choose a suitable career. Couples check their skulls for compatibility before marriage. It is a personality test, a career counsellor, and a fortune teller all delivered through the medium of your own head. There is a darker side that deserves a sober mention, because phrenology did not stay a harmless parlour amusement. Its confident pronouncements were used to rank people, to prop up ugly prejudices, and to argue that certain groups or certain criminals were simply born with the wrong-shaped heads. Dressed in scientific language, nonsense can do real harm, and this particular nonsense did its share. But the reason it caught on so completely is painfully familiar. Phrenology felt scientific, with its charts and its Latin-sounding faculties and its air of expertise. It promised to decode the mysterious people around you into simple, readable bumps, and it flattered everyone by taking their characters seriously enough to measure. A confident expert offering neat answers to messy human questions has never had trouble finding customers in your century or any other. So sit down, let the nice man feel your head and receive the verdict on your soul. He will tell you that you are cautious, affectionate, and just a touch too fond of argument, all read from the topography of your scalp. It is worth exactly nothing. But if it makes you feel understood, well, Your sentry got there long before the personality quiz, and it charged you handsomely for the privilege. Here is one where the strange old saying turns out to be grimly, uncomfortably true. Making fashionable felt hats in your sentry involves treating animal fur with a compound of mercury, and the workers who do this breathe those fumes day after day in cramped, poorly ventilated little workshops. Over time, the mercury slowly poisons them, producing trembling hands, slurred speech, memory trouble, irritability, and deepening confusion. The condition becomes common enough that a hatter behaving strangely is more or less expected, and the phrase about being as mad as a hatter enters everyday language for a very real and very sad reason. So the next time you admire a beautifully made top hat, remember that somebody may have quietly surrendered their health to build it. Fashion, in your sentry, carries an astonishing body count. To understand how this happens, you have to follow a hat backward to the workshop. The finest hats are made of felt, and felt is made by matting animal fur together into a dense, smooth material. To make the fur mat properly, workers brush it with a solution containing mercury, a process that leaves the fur ready to be shaped, but also leaves an invisible poison hanging in the air of the room. Now picture that room. It is hot, close, and steamy, filled with the fumes rising off the treated fur as it is worked, pressed, and ironed into shape. There is little ventilation, because ventilation costs money and lets the heat escape. The workers spend long days in this haze, breathing it in hour after hour, year after year, absorbing a little more mercury with every shift. Nobody hands them a mask, nobody opens a window, they simply work, and the poison quietly accumulates. The effects, when they come, are heartbreaking and unmistakable. The hands begin to tremble, a shaking so characteristic it earns its own nickname among the trade. Speech grows slurred and hesitant, teeth loosen and fall out. The mind clouds, memory fails, and the temperament changes, often into a painful mix of crushing shyness and sudden irritability, jumpiness, and outbursts. In the worst cases come anxiety, delusions, and a genuine unravelling. A person is being slowly poisoned into a stranger, and everyone around them can see it happen. The truly grim part is how thoroughly the age simply accepted it. A hatter with the shakes and a wandering mind was such a common sight that people barely questioned it, and the very phrase about being mad as a hatter passed into ordinary speech, a casual joke built on top of a real and preventable illness. Note that people were saying it long before a certain storybook character made the phrase famous, because the condition was already all around them, and it need not have happened, which is perhaps the hardest part. The danger of the process was not a total secret, and safer approaches were possible, but the cheap method made good hats, and the workers were considered easily replaced, so the poisoning simply carried on. Proper protection for these workers would not arrive until far beyond your century, long after countless hatters had paid for their trade with their health and their minds. So there sits the top hat, gleaming and immaculate, the crowning symbol of a respectable Victorian gentleman, an emblem of dignity and success. And somewhere behind it is a trembling, half-forgotten worker in a steaming back room who gave a piece of himself to make it. In your century, elegance and suffering are stitched together more often than anyone cares to admit. Wear the hat by all means. Just spare a thought for the hands that shook to make it. Let us step outside for some fresh air, and I use that phrase very loosely indeed. London in your century is vast, crowded, and disposing of all its waste directly into the River Thames, which has quietly become an open sewer running right through the heart of the city. In the sweltering summer of 1858, the smell grows so unbearable that it earns its own proper name, the Great Stink, and it is so overpowering that it very nearly drives the politicians straight out of Parliament whose windows happened to sit right beside the reeking river. Making matters far worse, most people firmly believe that disease spreads through bad smells, a theory called miasma, so the stench feels not merely unpleasant but genuinely deadly. The one upside is that the sheer horror of it finally forces the city to build a proper sewer system. Sometimes progress only arrives once the problem gets close enough to the powerful to offend their noses. The scale of the problem is difficult to overstate. The city has swollen with people faster than anyone planned for, and all of their waste has to go somewhere. The fashionable new flush toilets ironically only make it worse, sluicing ever more filth out of the cesspits and straight into the river. Add in the runoff from slaughterhouses, factories and tanneries, and the Thames becomes a slow-moving stew of everything the city would rather not think about, flowing right through the middle of everything. Then comes the heat. In that infamous summer, the weather turns hot and stays hot and the river bakes. The result is a stench so thick and so foul that it is described as almost physical, a gagging, eye-watering miasma that settles over the whole city and refuses to lift. People retch in the streets. Business along the riverbank grinds to a halt, and crucially, the politicians in their grand building perched directly on the water find that they can barely breathe. This, at last, gets things moving, because the powerful are now personally suffering. Members of Parliament try hanging curtains soaked in chemicals over the windows to hold back the smell, with almost no success. They openly discuss abandoning the building altogether and moving the whole government somewhere upriver and upwind. For once, the great and the good cannot simply look away from the filth, because the filth has come to sit right under their noses. Underpinning all the panic is the miasma theory, the widespread and mistaken belief that diseases like cholera are carried by foul-smelling air. So the stink is not merely revolting to your ancestors, it is terrifying, because they are convinced the very smell is spreading death. As it happens, they had the mechanism wrong. A clever doctor had recently shown that cholera actually travelled through contaminated water, not bad air, though few yet believed him. But being wrong for the right reasons still worked out, because cleaning up the reeking river was exactly what needed doing anyway. Out of the crisis comes one of the great achievements of the age. The horror finally shakes loose the money and the will to build an enormous network of sewers, designed by a brilliant engineer, carrying the city's waste far away from its heart. It transforms London and saves countless lives for generations, and there is the lesson your century leaves you, wrapped in a truly disgusting bow. The reform did not come when the poor were dying quietly of cholera in the slums. It came when the smell finally reached the windows of the men in charge. Take a deep breath of your clean modern air. It was purchased in part by one unbearable summer that offended exactly the right noses. Feeling hungry after all that fresh air? You may want to reconsider, because in your century you can almost never be certain what is actually in your food. Regulation is thin, cheating is rampant, and unscrupulous sellers happily bulk out their products with whatever is cheap and close to hand. Bread might be whitened and stretched with alum, chalk or ground plaster. Milk is watered down and occasionally tinted to hide the fact. Used tea leaves are dried, dyed, and quietly sold all over again. Sweets are brightened with metal-based dyes that are frankly poisonous, and pickles get their lovely green glow from copper. You cannot taste most of it, which is precisely the entire point. Every single meal is a small act of trust, and your century has not remotely earned it. The reasons this runs so wild are simple and depressing. Cities have exploded. Food now travels long distances from unseen hands. Competition is fierce, and there's almost nobody checking what goes into anything. Cheating is enormously profitable and very nearly impossible to detect by taste or sight. So a dishonest seller can pad his goods with cheap rubbish and pocket the difference. And who is going to stop him? Start with bread, the staple that fills most stomachs. White bread is prized as finer and more respectable, so bakers whiten cheap, inferior flour using alum, a chemical that also lets them get away with lower quality grain. To stretch a loaf further, some mix in chalk, ground up bone, or even plaster, the same sort of material you might smooth onto a wall. So your humble daily loaf, the honest heart of every meal, may quietly contain a helping of the building trade. Milk fares no better, and this one should trouble you because babies drink it. It is routinely watered down, sometimes with water of dubious cleanliness, then whitened back up with chalk or a little flour, and occasionally tinted to hide the thinning. In the worst cases, sickly cows kept in filthy conditions and fed on brewery waste produce a poor, tainted milk that is sold anyway. It is not a comforting glass. The trickery reaches nearly everything. Used tea leaves are dried out, recoloured with dyes, and sold as fresh, with green tea in particular faked using genuinely poisonous colouring. Coffee is padded with chicory, roasted grain, and even ground acorns. Pepper is cut with floor sweepings and dust, and the prettiest offenders are the sweets and pickles, coloured a cheerful, appetising green or red with compounds of lead, copper, and worse, meaning the brightest, most tempting candy in the shop window is quietly the most dangerous, and children are the ones buying it. The whole grim business is finally dragged into the light when a determined doctor starts putting ordinary shop-bought food under a microscope and publishing exactly what he finds, naming names and revealing just how universal the cheating truly is. The results horrify the public, and slowly, grudgingly, the first real laws against food adulteration begin to appear, weak at first, but a beginning. Until then, though, you eat on faith and hope. Compare it to your own world, where a label lists every ingredient down to the last trace, and inspectors lurk behind the scenes. In your century there is no label, no inspector, and no way to know whether your bread is mostly flour or mostly wool. So sit down, say your grace, and take a bite. In your century, dinner is less a meal and more a gamble you make 3 times a day. For dessert, let us get some ice cream from a street vendor in what has to be one of the least hygienic treats ever devised by human beings. It is called a penny lick. The seller scoops a small portion of ice cream into a little glass cup. You lick it clean right there on the street, and then you hand the glass straight back so it can be given, entirely unwashed, to the very next customer in line. That same little glass is used again and again all day long, passed from mouth to mouth to mouth, occasionally rinsed in a bucket of increasingly grim water, if you happen to be lucky. It is a marvel of efficiency, and a genuine nightmare of disease, helping to carry illness through whole neighbourhoods, one cheerful lick at a time. Do enjoy your treat. Try very hard not to think about the last 40 mouths. Ice cream, in your century, is a wonderful novelty and a rare affordable pleasure for the poor. On warm days, the street vendors are out in force, many of them immigrants who have brought the trade with them, working their barrows on busy corners with a cheerful cry to draw a crowd. Children especially adore them, clustering around with their pennies for a cold, sweet treat on a hot afternoon. So far, so charming. The trouble is entirely in the delivery system. The ice cream is served in a small, thick little glass cup, and here your century sneaks in a small con of its own, because the glass is made with a deep, heavy base that makes your portion look far larger than it actually is. You get a satisfying-looking glass and a rather small mouthful of ice cream. You lick it clean, right there on the pavement, and then you hand the glass back to the vendor. And that is where hygiene goes to die. The vendor does not wash the glass. At best, he gives it a quick dunk in a bucket of water that started the day clean and has since served hundreds of customers, growing steadily murkier and more alarming as the hours pass. Then he scoops the next portion into that same barely rinsed glass and hands it to the next eager child. The little cup goes from mouth to mouth to mouth all day long, a shared vessel passed among total strangers in the open street. In a century already riddled with tuberculosis and haunted by cholera, this is a genuinely efficient way to spread disease through a neighbourhood. Every licked and lightly swished glass becomes a small vehicle for whatever the last customer was carrying, and doctors eventually make the grim connection between these cheerful street treats and outbreaks of illness. The penny lick, it turns out, dispenses far more than dessert. Sense prevails only slowly. In time, the licked glass is recognised as the public health menace it is, and banned in the city, and it is eventually replaced by something both cleaner and better, the edible cone or wafer, which you eat along with the ice cream and which nobody has to hand back. It is one of the rare cases where your century stumbles into a solution that is genuinely superior in every way, hygienic and delicious at once. But for now, you stand on the corner with your little glass, savouring your cold treat under the summer sun. It tastes lovely. It looks like more than it is, and it has been intimately shared with a long anonymous parade of strangers whose health you know nothing about. Lick carefully. In your century, even dessert is a leap of faith. Not everyone in your century has the luxury of worrying about ice cream glasses, because at the very bottom of the economy, people survive by scavenging things you would not touch with a very long pole. Mudlarks, often children, wade through the foul, freezing mud of the Thames at low tide, hunting for scraps of coal, rope, and metal they can sell for a handful of pennies. Toshers venture down into the dark, dangerous sewers in search of lost coins and small valuables, risking collapse, poisonous air, and rats the size of small dogs. And then there are the pure finders, who gather dog waste from the streets and sell it to the tanneries where it is used to treat leather. These are all real jobs done by real people, simply so they can eat. The next time you feel like grumbling about your work, remember that someone once made a living gathering that. To understand these trades, you have to understand a city with no safety net at all. There is no help for the destitute worth the name, so the very poorest survive by finding value in whatever everyone else has thrown away or lost. In such a place, nothing is truly waste, because there is always someone hungry enough to collect it, clean it, and sell it on. An entire hidden economy runs on the scraps of the city. The mudlarks work the river. At low tide, when the Thames pulls back to reveal its cold, stinking banks, they climb down into the mud, most of them children or the elderly, and they search. They are looking for lumps of coal fallen from the barges, bits of rope, copper nails, scraps of iron, anything at all that can be sold for a few pennies. They work barefoot in the freezing muck, cutting their feet on hidden debris, racing the returning tide filthy to the bone for earnings that would barely buy a meal. The toshers go lower still, down into the sewers themselves. These are the sewer hunters, and they venture into the vast, dark, foul network beneath the streets, searching for coins, spoons, and bits of metal washed down from above. It is genuinely dangerous work. There are pockets of poisonous gas that can kill without warning, sudden surges of water that can drown a man, sections of tunnel that can collapse, and the famous rats. The toshers learn the tunnels intimately, often work in small groups for safety, and, for all the horror of the workplace, some of them reportedly do rather well from what they find down there. And then there are the pure finders, whose trade sounds almost too strange to be real. They walk the streets all day collecting dog waste by hand into a bucket. This was sold to the tanneries where, believe it or not, it played a genuine role in the process of cleaning and softening leather. It even had a polite trade name that made it sound almost respectable. It was steady work, in constant demand, and for some it was the difference between eating and not. Around these three there swarmed a whole ecosystem of the desperate. The rag pickers, the bone grubbers, the collectors of cigar ends and old nails, all recycling the leavings of a great city long before anyone called it recycling. Much of what we know about them survives, because a curious journalist went out and actually spoke to these people, writing down their lives in careful detail. There is no punchline here, only a bit of perspective. These were not idle folk. They worked brutally hard at grim, dangerous, thankless jobs with real skill and real dignity, simply to survive another day. So when your own work feels wearisome, spare a genuine thought for them, and be quietly grateful for the distance between your century and theirs. Here is a job that sounds entirely made up, but absolutely was not. The cat's meat man. In the crowded cities of your century, keeping a pet is common, and feeding that pet creates a small, strange, thriving little industry. The cat's meat man walks the streets pushing his barrow, selling scraps of cheap, low-grade horse meat skewered onto wooden sticks, intended for the cats and dogs of the household. Local people know his call by heart, and pets across the neighbourhood reportedly recognise it too, gathering at doorsteps in hopeful anticipation. He's a familiar, respectable, almost comforting fixture of everyday life, a travelling pet food shop long before tins and kibble are ever imagined. It is oddly charming, honestly, right up until you remember exactly what the meat usually is, and precisely where the horse used to be. Consider the situation that creates the trade. The cities are full of pet cats and dogs, kept for company, for catching mice, or simply for love. But there is no such thing yet as a bag of dried pet food from a shop, and household scraps alone are not enough to keep a growing city's worth of animals fed. Something has to fill the gap, and where there is a need, your century reliably produces a man with a barrow to meet it. That man buys his stock cheap, from the sort of meat considered unfit for people to eat. In practice, this means a great deal of horse meat, sourced from the yards where old, worn-out, injured or sick horses meet their end. He boils it, cuts it into portions and skewers those portions onto little wooden sticks, ready to sell door to door. It is not glamorous, and the smell of the barrow is memorable, but it is honest work and there is steady demand for it. His days follow a familiar rhythm. He works a regular round through his patch of the city, pushing his barrow and calling out his distinctive cry, and his customers know exactly when to expect him. A household might buy a stick a day to keep the family cat contented. He becomes a fixture, as much a part of the street as the lamplighter or the milkman, a small reliable thread in the fabric of city life. The most delightful detail, and one that seems to be genuinely true, concerns the animals themselves. Cats and dogs across a neighbourhood learn the cat's meat man's call, and come running the moment they hear it, gathering at doors and gates in hopeful little crowds, waiting for their daily portion. Imagine the sound of that cry drifting down a street, and a dozen cats materialising from windowsills and alleyways, all business, all appetite. It is a small, warm piece of ordinary Victorian life. Of course, there is a grimmer underside, as there always is. The source of the meat, the knackers' yards and the dead horses, is not something anyone dwells on. In a hungry city, there are also uneasy rumours and dark jokes about whether every scrap of cat's meat really only ever ended up in front of a cat. It is best not to inquire too closely, and most people did not. It is a substantial trade too. In a great city, a large number of men make their entire living this way, moving tons of meat between them, keeping the pets of the poor and comfortable alike fed. So the next time you tip a scoop of kibble into a bowl from a brightly labelled bag, picture the alternative. A man, a barrow, a stick of boiled horse, and a very enthusiastic cat. In your century, that was simply how the cat got fed. Not every strange feature of your century is amusing, and this is one of the hardest to sit with. For much of the era, chimneys are cleaned by climbing boys, children as young as 5 or 6, small enough to be sent up the narrow, twisting flues to scrape away the soot by hand. It is brutal, exhausting, terrifying work. The children suffer scrapes, burns, and lasting lung damage, along with a grim illness caused by constant exposure to soot, and some become trapped, or worse, inside the chimneys themselves. Reformers campaign for years against the practice while others resist them, insisting coldly that the boys are simply cheaper than brushes. It takes a very long time and a great deal of argument before the law finally moves to protect them. Behind the tidy, cheerful fireplaces of your century, there is a real cost that nobody much likes to look at directly. The system works, if that is the word, like this. A master sweep takes on very young boys, often orphans, or the children of families so poor they have little choice but to hand them over, precisely because a small body can fit where a grown one cannot. The flues of your century are narrow, sometimes only the width of a small child, and they twist and turn in the dark. A brush cannot always follow those bends, but a frightened child can be sent up to do it by hand. Inside the chimney it is pitch black, cramped and choking with soot. The child climbs by bracing knees and elbows against the rough brick, inching upward, scraping the caked soot loose as he goes. His elbows and knees rub raw and bleed against the stone, and there was a hardening practice so cruel it is difficult to repeat, in which the wounds were deliberately toughened over time rather than treated. The children breathe soot constantly, their lungs filling with it, and the flues are sometimes still hot from recent fires. The dangers are not occasional, they are constant. Children became wedged in tight bends and could not free themselves. Some suffocated in the dark, and the relentless exposure to soot caused a specific and terrible cancer, one that a physician had identified as a disease of this trade long before your century even began, making it one of the earliest work-cause cancers ever recognized. The warning was there, it was simply ignored. Perhaps the darkest detail is how reluctant children were forced upward when fear got the better of them. A boy who froze or refused might be driven on by pins jabbed into his feet, or a fire lit in the grate beneath him, a practice so plainly cruel that it needs no comment. These were small children, doing this because they were poor and powerless and cheap. Against all this stood the reformers, who fought for years to end it. Laws were passed and then widely ignored, because enforcement was weak and the boys had no voice of their own. A mechanical brush existed that could do much of the work without a child at all, yet many masters simply refused to use it, insisting the old way was cheaper. It took decades, repeated tragedies, a famous children's story that stirred public sympathy, and finally the death of one more child sweep before real, enforced law at last brought the practice to an end. So when you picture a cosy Victorian parlour, its fire crackling, its chimney drawing clean and clear, hold in your mind for a moment the child who was sent up into the dark to make it so. Not everything about your century is a curiosity to smile at. Some of it is simply a debt owed to children whose names were never written down. Tonight, at least, they are remembered. Toward the later years of your century, a thrilling new machine arrives to absolutely terrify the establishment. The bicycle. Suddenly women can travel entirely on their own, with no chaperone, going wherever they please at whatever speed they choose, and a certain type of anxious gentleman finds this development deeply alarming. So the experts helpfully invent reasons it must be stopped. Doctors gravely warn of bicycle face, a supposed condition in which the strain and worry of cycling permanently freezes a woman's features into a tense, exhausted, unattractive expression. There are dire warnings about her health, her morals, and the terrible dangers of a lady enjoying herself unsupervised. None of it is true, of course. The real fear is not the woman's face, it is the fact that she can now simply pedal away. For most of the century, the bicycle is an awkward, dangerous contraption, all towering wheels and broken wrists, strictly for daring young men. But then the design improves dramatically with 2 sensible wheels of equal size and cushioned tyres, and suddenly cycling is comfortable, affordable, and open to everyone. A genuine craze sweeps the country, and for the first time in history, huge numbers of ordinary women take to the road on their own 2 wheels. For women, this is nothing short of revolutionary, and everyone senses it immediately. A bicycle means freedom of movement without a carriage, a horse, or a chaperone hovering at your elbow. A woman can decide entirely by herself to go somewhere, and then simply go, at her own pace, on her own errand, out of sight of anyone who might supervise her. She can get fresh air, exercise, and a taste of independence that the parlour never offered. It even forces a rethinking of clothing, because you cannot pedal freely in a cage of hoops and yards of heavy skirt. So practical cycling dress arrives and scandalises the traditionalists all over again. Naturally, this cannot be allowed to pass without a fight, and so the anxious minds of the age get to work. Manufacturing reasons, the whole thing is terribly dangerous, specifically for women. The star of this effort is the celebrated warning about bicycle face. According to solemn medical pronouncements, the effort of balancing and the strain of cycling produce a tense, flushed, wild-eyed, exhausted expression, and if a woman rides too much, that expression will supposedly set into her features permanently, leaving her forever grim and unattractive. The warnings do not stop there. Cycling is said to damage women's delicate health, to threaten their ability to have children, to be immodest, and above all to be dangerous, precisely because it lets a woman roam unsupervised. Somehow, curiously, none of these dreadful effects ever seem to trouble the men who cycle in exactly the same way. The face-freezing epidemic is apparently choosy about its victims, which rather gives the game away. The bicycle face panic is not medicine at all. It is anxiety in a lab coat, a thin scientific costume thrown over a much older fear. The fear of a woman with somewhere to go and the means to get there by herself. The warnings were nonsense. Cycling was healthy and liberating, and the panic faded while the women kept right on riding. Many came to see the humble bicycle as one of the great quiet engines of their growing freedom. So picture her then, at the close of your century, a woman on a bicycle, pedalling down an open road, entirely unchaperoned, entirely herself, wind in her face and a whole world suddenly within reach. The experts warn that her expression will freeze that way. Let it. She's not worried about her face. She's far too busy getting away. Let us end the night with something festive, or at least something the Victorians themselves considered festive. Your century essentially invents the modern Christmas card, and you would reasonably expect cheerful robins, cosy firesides, and sprigs of holly. You would be entirely wrong. A startling number of Victorian Christmas cards are baffling, unsettling, or openly disturbing. Dead birds lying stiff on their backs, frogs cheerfully murdering one another, giant menacing insects, and strange little figures wishing you the joy of the season in the least joyful way imaginable. Nobody is fully certain why, though a genuine fondness for the melancholy and a very different sense of humour almost certainly play their part. So as you drift off tonight, picture a Victorian family gathered by candlelight, lovingly exchanging a greeting card featuring a deceased robin, and warmly wishing one another a Merry Christmas. It is the perfect little image to sum up the strangest respectable century in history. The Christmas card itself is a genuine invention of your era. The story goes that a busy man, buried under a mountain of letters he was expected to answer by hand at Christmas, hit upon the idea of a single printed card he could simply send to everyone, saving himself the labour. The notion caught on. Cheap printing and affordable postage did the rest, and before long the whole country is posting festive greetings to one another by the million. A charming new tradition is born. You would expect the pictures on these cards to be warm and seasonal, and some are. But an astonishing number veer straight off into the strange, the morbid, and the frankly nightmarish, and once you start looking, you cannot stop. Consider the gallery of oddities. There are dead robins over and over, little birds lying stiff and lifeless on their backs, printed beneath a cheerful holiday greeting. There are animals behaving with startling violence, frogs robbing and stabbing one another, creatures locked in duels, all in the name of festive fun. There are enormous insects and unsettling beetles offering their warm seasonal wishes. There are weeping children, sinister figures, and people with heads made of turnips and other vegetables staring blankly out at you. It is Christmas, but filtered through a fever dream. People have tried for years to explain it, with only partial success. The endlessly recurring robin has one likely thread of an answer, because the men who delivered all these cards, the postmen, were nicknamed after robins on account of their bright red uniforms, which is why the little bird became tangled up with Christmas post in the first place. Why so many of the robins are dead, however, is far murkier, and probably owes something to your centuries-deep and comfortable familiarity with death, a sentimentality that could find something tender even in a small frozen bird. Beyond that, the honest answer is simply that the Victorians had a different sense of humour and a different relationship with the macabre than we do. Things they found whimsical, droll, or charmingly odd strike us as deeply unhinged, and a century so thoroughly surrounded by death, as we have seen all night long, thought nothing of folding a little of it into the season of good cheer. And really that single image is the whole century in miniature. Picture them once more, that respectable family by candlelight, impeccably mannered, buttoned to the chin, passing around a lovingly chosen greeting card of a dead bird and wishing one another every joy of the season, entirely sincere and not the least bit troubled by it. Outwardly proper, inwardly bizarre, oddly at peace with death, and completely earnest about all of it. That is your century. Strange, dark, funny, and somehow rather wonderful. Merry Christmas from the dead robin. Sleep well. And there it is, a single strange day drifting through the strangest respectable century in history. You woke in a narrow brick house that smelled of coal smoke and secrets, admired wallpaper that was quietly poisoning you, and got dressed in a corset with strong opinions and a skirt that could set you on fire. You brushed shoulders with the dead in photographs and around séance tables, wore your grandmother woven into a bracelet and lay awake fearing you might one day wake beneath the earth, with only a little bell for company. You dodged arsenic in the sweets and plaster in the bread, licked a glass of ice cream that 100 strangers had already enjoyed, and somewhere across town a perfectly respectable family lovingly exchanged a greeting card featuring a dead robin and wished one another a Merry Christmas. It is easy to laugh at your ancestors, and we have gently all night long, but spare them a little wonder too. They lived without antibiotics, without water they could trust, without any real safety net at all, and still they invented, celebrated, mourned, fell in love and carried on. The children sent up the chimneys, the women scavenging the cold river mud, the trembling hatters in their workshops. They endured a world that asked far too much and gave far too little, and somehow they carried the whole strange thing forward so that you would not have to. So tonight, as you settle into your soft, safe bed, with clean water a tap away, warm light overhead, and not a trace of arsenic on the walls, breathe out slowly and let the century drift off with you. Be grateful for the quiet comforts they never knew, and sleep well, easily, gently, Knowing the wallpaper means you no harm at all.